Okay. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. My name is Caitlin Hoff Mahoney, and I'm the executive director here at the Matheson History Museum. We are really delighted to be partnering with Florida Humanities for the last stop of this book tour. So I have a few things I'd like to say before we get started and I turn over the microphone. First, I want to thank our sponsors for all of our exhibits and programs. Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, the City of Gainesville, and the State of Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and of course, Florida Humanities. We have a couple of really exciting things coming up with Florida Humanities. This is the first event, and then I'm really excited for our next exhibit that will be in this space. Right now, we have the Great Southern Music Hall. That will be up for about another month. It's coming down after June 8th. And we will be getting this summer Voices and Votes, Democracy in America, a traveling Smithsonian exhibit that is being sponsored by Florida Humanities. We are the third of 5 stops in Florida this year, so we are really thrilled for that. Thank you. And we will be having all sorts of programs going on related to that, so stay tuned. We'll be announcing those very soon. And then I also wanted to invite you all to join us on Saturday. We will be bringing back for the first time since 2020 the Floridiana sale. This is going to be a really exciting thing here in this room. It will be chock full of vendors with all sorts of cool vintage Florida things that you can buy and take home with you. So it's going to be really fun. If you're a member of the museum, you get first crack at the good stuff starting at 10 a.m. And then for the general public, it will be open at 11. So I hope you'll come out and join us this Saturday for the Floridiana sale. And I think that is all of my announcements. So I'm now going to introduce the director of Florida Humanities. Dr. Nasheed Madyun is the executive director of Florida Humanities and has been in that role since May of 2021, where he has brought 2 decades of experience as a historian, museum professional, and educator to the second largest humanities council in the country. Prior to joining Florida Humanities, he was the director of the Southeastern Regional Black Archives at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University in Tallahassee. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over the microphone and let's get started.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So you didn't come here to see or hear from me, so I'll be quick, but I'm very excited. This exhibit is amazing. I really love storytelling, and music is one of the few ways that can bridge cultures in such a fascinating, dynamic way. And this is remarkable. I keep looking up. You got Ramsey Lewis, B.B. King, Earl Scruggs. I was watching. So, all right. But as mentioned, Nasheed Madyun, I am the executive director of Florida Humanities, and we're celebrating our 50th year. And in that 50, in those 50 years, we've had the pleasure to distribute around the state over $20 million to cultural institutions, libraries, museums, historic houses, much like this one. And in doing so, we find that we have a remarkable position to capture and share the stories of Florida's. And that can be environment, cuisine, ethics, religion, and we love doing so with the use and partnership of museums and scholars and writers and journalists and thinkers, and we bring it to the public. One of the remarkable opportunities we had was to comb through Four magazine, a publication of the last 30 plus years, and bring together this publication in partnership with the University Press of Florida. Once Upon a Time in Florida, Stories of Life in the Land of Promises. And you get to hear more about that with the editor, Jacki Levine. And it's a wonderful, wonderful experience, painstaking because of more than 800 articles. How do we get to 50 articles and 150 photographs, right? And an example of that wonderful literature, it's in your seats. There's a plastic bag with a magazine that has a focus on water and the environment. And if you enjoyed the talk tonight and you enjoy some of the conversations, which we encourage you to engage in, we would like, for one, look at our calendar of events and find a speaker, not just in Gainesville, but around the states, and learn about maybe Tarpon Springs, the Panhandle, the Keys. We're around the state, and these activities are free to you. If you're a member, you can grab a passport. We update those activities. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce Jacki Levine, a friend of mine now, for the past say about 2.5 years, we've been trying to cull this craft into a package that's meaningful for you and your friends. But to tell you a little bit more about Jacki, and I believe some of you already know her, Jacki Levine, from 2017 to 2021, she was editor of our magazine Forum. Prior to that, she was managing editor of the Gainesville Sun newspaper for 14 years and the founding editor of Gainesville Magazine. She grew up in Miami Beach and she currently calls Gainesville home. All right, and so without further ado,
Thank you. She, I'm about to read your speech. No, no. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. We are so happy to have you here. And welcome to the last stop on our official Once Upon a Time in Florida book tour. We've traveled the state since we began in October, and we're thrilled to bring it all back home to Gainesville. I'm also thrilled to make a Bob Dylan reference, a little one there with bringing it all back home, if you remember the album, where we launched the anthology in the fall. At each stop along the way, we've talked with a panel of anthology contributors about the topics that make up the different sections of our book. From beginnings, which looks at the earliest years, we're talking about 14,000 years ago of Florida, to tonight's discussion inspired by the final section, Roots and Rivers. Tonight, we'll talk to Cynthia Barnett and Jacki Davis, who you all know, two of today's most critically acclaimed writers, about two powerful forces that shape our lives and how they intersect. One, Florida's mighty yet imperiled environment, and two, the power of the storyteller and the stories they tell. Before we start our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to tell you just a little bit about the making of this anthology, Once Upon a Time in Florida. But first, I'm going to pose what's become my favorite question. I ask it everywhere I go, and I've been asking it all over the state. And I think this question illuminates why sharing our stories as Floridians is so important. Ready? Okay. Ready? You're good. How many of you here tonight claim Florida roots that span generations? Please raise your hand if you have at least one great-grandparent born in Florida. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's actually, believe it or not, that's kind of a lot. Okay. Grandparent born in Florida. All right. All right. So counting the ones, now we're up to about 6 or 7. Okay, how many of you have a parent who was born in Florida? Okay. All right, so we're still around the 6. All right. All right, and here's a good one too. How many of you were actually born in Florida yourselves? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. All right. But so many of us, as you can see, are relative newcomers. We're here by choice or by chance. And so our identities and our loyalties are often split. Beloved native son Bob Graham, the late former governor, I hate to say the late, the late former governor and U.S. senator, whose story is in our anthology, called it the Cincinnati factor. We may be Floridians, but we also belong to Des Moines or Denver, Birmingham or Bogota, Harrisburg or Havana, Cincinnati or Saigon, which is where Florida Humanities and this anthology come in, to help us understand and appreciate our state in all its complexities and find our place in it, to see the deeper, richer Florida beneath the surface of the superficial version. When I became editor of Forum, the magazine of Florida Humanities, one of the great pleasures was my time in its archives, stored among the treasures of the University of South Florida's digital collection. I'd go looking to see if we had covered a story that I was about to assign or if we had what we had written about it. And every quick search led to a labyrinth as bewitching as Florida's underground caves. And every time I emerged, I was convinced anew that the timeless stories of our state stowed in these archives needed to be brought to the surface, to be seen and read again. And so as Florida Humanities' 50th anniversary approached, the idea took hold to publish an anthology of gems from the stories published by Forum over the last 35 years. And I was thrilled, honestly, because I knew it would be a wonderful experience. But since there were about 800 stories in the archives, selecting 50 to celebrate the 50 years of Florida Humanities was a joyful but a challenging task. We wanted this to be more than a best of, but we wanted it to tell a story of Florida. We settled on a once upon a time narrative of Florida, arranged chronologically and thematically into 7 parts and 50 stories, spanning some 14,000 years of our history, from the first Floridians to contemporary life as it unfolds today. These stories were produced by some of the finest writers and scholars in the country, including 3 Pulitzer Prize winners. Each section adds to a complex portrait of our state, from its beginnings to its coming of age, as a state of inspiration, as a magnet for dreamers and doers, for those seeking a fast buck or simply sanctuary, to its years of struggle with inequality, to its glorious but fragile natural gifts, which finally leads us to our conversation with tonight's panel. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, though they really clearly need no introduction in this room or in most rooms in Gainesville. Cynthia Barnett is an award-winning environmental journalist and the author of 4 books, including The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans, and Rain, A Natural and Cultural History, both named among the best science books of the year by NPR's Science Friday. She is a 5th-generation Floridian and lives in Gainesville, where she teaches environmental journalism and directs climate and environment reporting initiatives at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. Jacki Davis is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Bald Eagle, The Improbable Journey of America's Bird, The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, and in Everglades, Providence, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the American Environmental Century. He is a professor of history and the Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities at the University of Florida. We will now move. Yeah, not so easy. Yes, graceful. Okay. Okay, so we have questions in 3 different sections, and we wanted to really delve into not just the anthology itself, but also the art of storytelling, which these 2 are complete masters. So, but let's start off with the power of the storyteller. So, Jack wrote 2 stories that ended up in the anthology. One about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and how her work and her words transformed the Everglades. And he wrote a story about the Gulf, which went on to become a book that won the Pulitzer Prize. And Cynthia wrote one of the most beautiful tributes I have ever read. I was just so amazed by this, about Bill Belleville, who was an environmental writer and particularly about water and a much beloved figure. And both these people that they wrote about illustrate the impact committed environmentalist wordsmith can have on preserving our natural world. In both cases, their tools to do this was the written word. So what I'm going to ask both of you tonight is, how did the work of these individuals and other writers make a lasting impact on Florida's environment?
You're looking at
I'm
me.
looking at you, kid.
So is Bo Diddley, by the way.
Yeah.
Listen, before we start, since this is the last stop on the beautiful book tour, I think we should all give Jacki Levine a round of applause.
Yeah. Wow.
Once Upon a Time in Florida is just a beautiful and triumphant book, and really brings us together. And I've bought it for all gifts for Floridians and non-Floridians for the past year, and it's just terrific. So thanks for doing it.
This is one of the most supportive individuals you will ever meet anywhere.
So so my piece is a little bit unusual because it was about another writer. It was about Bill Belleville. Who's familiar with Bill Belleville's work? Those of you who aren't familiar with his work, you're in for such a treat. I would highly recommend his books. Salvaging the Real Florida is a wonderful book about his neighborhood outside of Orlando, and kind of what happens when things changed in his little cracker house, and everything around it changed. And he wrote a book about that process and that loss. And he got mail and messages from all over the nation, from people who shared that sense of loss and really understood it. And I think Bill Belleville really touched a nerve. So to answer your questions, and he wrote 7 books in all. They're all lovely. His book about the St. Johns River is one of the best biographies you'll ever read about a river. It's called River of Lakes. So he wrote 7 books altogether. And like many of us, he traveled all over the world, but he was most powerful when he turned to his own home. And the most important part of Florida to him was the Wekiva River. And so he did a lot of writing and advocacy surrounding the Wekiva River, and he made a tangible difference in the restoration of the Wekiva River and its preservation. 70,000 acres surrounding the river, surrounding the basin, are preserved by the state. It's a Florida Outstanding Water, a Florida Canoe Trail, an aquatic preserve, a national wild and scenic river. And I would say that he had direct influence on all of that. So that's really profound to think that his influence was both inspirational to people, but then also tangibly he got stuff done.
He made a huge difference.
Yes.
And what I loved about your tribute to him is you went out on the river yourself and sort of communed with him, and the way she integrated his images and his writing into this story, you really felt compelled to read him, and you really felt a real understanding of his love for the river and his love for natural Florida. And it was a wonderful tribute to him. It was just wonderful. So, we were talking about the work of environmentalists who happen to be wordsmiths and how they made such an incredible impact in their world. So the question for you, Jack, is to talk about the request is to talk a little bit about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who you wrote a beautiful essay about her for Forum that appears in the anthology.
Thank you. Yes. The Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, first of all, a lot of people don't really know much about her, sadly. We're forgetting about her in Florida. I'm going to ask any one of my students at UF, and have been doing this for 20 years, how many of them know about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and not even get a hand raised. And which is very sad to me. Somebody spent years writing her biography, and before she was an environmentalist, she was first and foremost a storyteller, and a wonderful one. When she was a kid growing up in Massachusetts, she wanted to be a writer. She was a lifelong feminist. She was a champion extraordinaire of intellectual freedom in this state. So, again, long before she was an environmentalist, a staunch supporter of the First Amendment, a loud critic of those who try to trample on First Amendment rights and diminish intellectual freedom as there was a movement. You think we have a movement now? There was a movement in the 1950s to do exactly that. And she was a founding member of the Florida ACLU, the first ACLU chapter south of the Mason-Dixon line, in direct opposition of state oppression, trying to silence people, trying to destroy the NAACP in Florida, failed to do that, and then turned their attention to alleged homosexuals in the schools and colleges, including the University of Florida. And she was staunchly opposed to that. So this is all to say that she was a social activist before she was an environmental activist. And a lot of her social activism made it into her writing. And one thing she wrote a column for the Miami Herald, the newspaper that her father founded, for 3 years in the 1920s and 1922. She said, "It never ceases to amaze me that these people who go about banning books have the awful task of having to read them." So, but in any case, she spent 20 years writing short stories for the Saturday Evening Post. And the natural world, natural Florida, most of them are set in Florida and in South Florida. And the natural Florida is always in these stories. And when I was writing her biography, it struck me that the natural Florida in her stories is not a backdrop, it is a character. And that has always stuck with me. And Cynthia and I are writing partners. We read and draft what the other person writes. And so we have a lot of conversations about the natural world and how it's a historical agent, that it's not just about people imposing their will on nature, but nature has this capacity to shape the course of human history. And she very much believed that. She wrote about that in the 1920s. And she was far ahead of her time. And again, a beautiful story writer. And very much an inspiration for me. Her writing style, her language, her choice of words, and of course the way she tells a story, and she understood the power of storytelling very much so. And this book, and I'll just say this and stop. But this book, most people don't know anything about this book beyond the first line, which is one of the most famously quoted first lines of a book. There are no other Everglades in the world. But in the 1940s, extraordinary. She understood ecology like a lot of scientists didn't. There was only one other person who understood how the Everglades ecosystem, how that system itself worked, and she was one of them, writing about in the 1940s. Also in this book, she tells us the history of Florida, and she treats enslaved people and Native peoples not as objects of history, but as real subjects who were actors in our past. And she in the days that she was writing this, a lot of anthropologists were still referring to Indians as bronze gods. And she was much more respectful of that, and used their language when she could, and looked at their world from their perspective the best that she could.
And just with a few words, she really did change the perspective on the Everglades.
Yes, exactly. River of Grass. Yes, I mean it's some people have criticized it, that name that she gave the Everglades as being too narrow, that the river grass is more than just sawgrass. She obviously understood that, but this title, River, I mean, this name, Rivergrass, is so poetic, it's so memorable, but also she's one of the few people, and I do this too because she did it, refers to the Everglades in the plural. You read anybody else and they're referring to the Everglades as the Everglades is, not the Everglades are, because she understood how the, the biodiversity of the Everglades and the value of that biodiversity.
Yeah, wonderful. And thank you for talking about Bill Belleville too. And now we're going to shift because I'd love to spend more time on this, but I really want to go to the section 2 because I'd like to hear your personal stories. How you became the preeminent environmental writers you are. I know some of your story, Donna, but talk a bit about your personal journeys to becoming environmental writers. And why you've chosen to do this and why communicating through the humanities is such an important part of what you do as opposed to just pure science. So Jack, well, no, yeah, you go.
Those were a lot of questions at once, Jackie. You know something I think might be interesting to point out right now is that what Jack and I teach at the University of Florida did not exist not too long ago. So and this kind of gets around to answering Jackie's question where I came from. I came up as a very traditional journalist. That is my identity. I'm a journalist with a capital J. I was the editor of my Girl Scout newspaper in the 5th grade. And I've always been a journalist. So that's how I came up. And when I was really becoming increasingly interested in the environment as a reporter, and I kind of wanted the answers to questions, who got to decide that they could fill that wetland or raise that mangrove forest or build that condo there. Why are things the way they are here in Florida? So I wanted to go back to school and get a master's degree, and I was interested in environmental history. And there was no Jack Davis at the University of Florida then. They didn't have environmental history. So I was very lucky in that I sought out Dr. David Colburn, who some of you know. He became sort of a mentor and chaired my committee and made up a curriculum of environmental history for me before there was one. Likewise, in my college, there was no such thing as environmental journalism taught until I started teaching at UF 8 years ago. So these things are now being professionalized, but of course they've always been there. So for me, I think there's this edge. One, it is a deep inspiration. I'm inspired by wild Florida and by wilds generally, and that is everything from a great thunderstorm to a spring to a forest. But there's also, I admit that there is also an edge of anger to it. Like, why does that get to happen? And sort of all the injustices involved in environment, both human and injustices to humans, animals, and nature. So that's kind of where it is, that edge space. I don't think I answered all your questions, but I know that
you did a pretty good job, though. But I'm wondering, do you think being a 5th generation Floridian and growing up in a different sort of South Florida when you were young, do you think that had any impact?
I do. I grew up in both Florida and California, and especially when I think about my childhood, which was in a fairly rural area, I think a lot about the drama of things like rain and thunderstorms and hurricanes. I was definitely shaped a lot by weather, and that's how I came to be Rain's biographer, which is my favorite title.
Yes, finger. Yeah. Yeah. And I think Florida kids do grow up with that real sense of weather because the hurricanes were our snow days, right? We got to stay home from school. We loved it. And we'd look out the window and everything would be blowing around. And there was an excitement because
For sure.
we weren't going to be taking care of the damage after. So we got to just look out the window. But yeah, it's been very interesting to see your evolution over the last decade or two. But okay, so Jack, how about you?
So when I was in graduate school, in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s, I specialized in Southern race relations because there were no jobs being advertised in environmental history. But I prepared a secondary field of environmental history when I was at Brandeis. And we didn't have an environmental historian, and I did my environmental history with David, David Hackett Fisher, and who was fantastic, as a matter of fact. And but I couldn't get a job in environmental history, but I'd get a job in Southern race relations, and I would make myself more marketable by saying I can also teach environmental history. And that actually didn't work. I published I published an article on the desegregation of Major League Spring Training, and everybody in the job interview wanted to talk about that article. Nobody asked any questions about environmental history because they didn't really know what to ask. My first job was at Ecker College. The very first class I taught was environmental history. And I was their first environmental historian. Then I went to the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I was their first environmental historian. Then I came here in 2003 and I was U.S. First environmental historian. But how did I get there? Why environmental history? And by the time after I published my first book, which is on race, the first couple of books which were on race relations, and got tenure, I made a shift over to environmental historian. And that's, of course, how I've been defining myself for years. And I was born in Florida. I didn't get to raise my hand. If you had asked about our children, I could have, but you didn't ask about children.
Yes.
I've got one. I was born here. No, okay, right. And so,
You feel
yeah, I do. And but we moved to Florida when I was to the Florida Panhandle, Santa Rosa Sound. Anybody ever lived up Mary Esther, Florida? We lived on Santa Rosa Sound. I was in the 6th grade, and there was a neighborhood. And so I was like, no kids, no neighborhood, no kids, no bicycles running up and down the streets because right there in my 90s. But on the sound became the cul-de-sac of my youth. And squared back to me with a 6 horsepower outboard became my bicycle, and my rod and reel became my bat and ball, and my dog became my companion. And I spent all my time out there. I didn't teach us about nature in school, in public school in Florida, but I had the sound that was teaching me so much. And then we moved down to the Tampa Bay area, and I learned that I spent all my time on the water there too, and I learned that I love intense weather. I love, particularly on the coast, those afternoon thunderstorms that blow through and wash the day clean, and then they're gone in a half an hour, and then everything is just brighter and more vibrant, and you see the real beauty of Florida comes despite the concrete and steel. You see the vibrant Florida, and it's persistent. It's raised demanding. Natural Florida is to forget that it's there. And so it's been present in my life, and just league. I love hurricanes. I love thunderstorms.
we love it all until we have to repeat it.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's just something that I connected that that is connected with something deep inside me. And then when I was exposed to writers like Margie Stoneman Douglas, I read The River of Grass lying on my back in a tent in the Everglades. The best place to and then Archie Carr. Oh my gosh, Archie Carr, one of our great writers, a scientist who literary awards. And so when you're exposed to writers like that, you emulate them, which isn't you equal, that you try to equal. And and they just they and many others led me to become an environmental writer. That and natural Florida. Yeah, I think it would have been different if I'd grown up somewhere else.
This is why it's important to read good writers and not bad.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, whether it's short, whether it's long, good writers are important. Expose yourself to good writers or good writing.
I just want to add.
Bad writers are writers. I mean, good writers are bad people.
Yeah, that's okay. As long as they're good writers, you can read.
Right.
And I wanted to say, because when Jack was talking about his years in the Panhandle, it just waxed beautifully about that. He actually has written about that for Forum. He wrote this wonderful story. I don't know if you remember, I asked him to do it when I was editor, about taking his daughter back to his old neighborhood.
Yep.
Several years ago.
To the Sound, there was no neighborhood.
No neighborhood except for the Sound. And It's a beautiful story. So
you
can also go to the University of South Florida Digital Archives and look it up. It's a great story. So we're going to move along, and we lost a little bit of time, so we're going over a little bit, Stephanie. I hope that's okay. But I wanted section 3, and I think this is really fascinating to me. And Jack alluded to it a few minutes ago, the writing process. So what does it mean to you both to be writing partners and serving as early readers of each other's work? And I'm going to ask just that one question, and I'll come back and follow it up. Cynthia.
Well, we both wake up really early. So one thing it means to be writing partners is that if we are working on a piece of writing and feel stuck, even with a sentence or a paragraph, we email each other at 5 a.m. and we're both awake and we just respond right away. And it's also very honest feedback. So we're just like, that's bad, start over. It's just very, very honest.
Sugarcoating it.
No.
No, I got in trouble once because Cynthia thought I was holding back.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's really different because I'm also married to a writer. And when my husband gives me feedback, he has to sugarcoat it, right? Somewhat. It really would not work out. So what I tell.
I look like that sometimes when I'm reading Cynthia's.
But to answer Jacki's question, what I talk to my students about is the importance of building a brain trust when you're a writer. So hopefully, Jack and I didn't meet until we had both published books already. And I think we both realized the value, saw our work improving through this relationship. But so for the students, I talk with them about building a brain trust, finding people in your life who can read your copy, who wake up the same time you do, and who you can email back and forth, and who really give you honest feedback and care a lot about that kind of work to help you become better.
So I'll give you actually an example. When I was writing the prologue to the Gulf book, which was the last thing I wrote, and focusing on the opening paragraphs because that's what you want. Those are your paragraphs. You want to bring your readers in immediately. It took me months to write those first couple of paragraphs. Cynthia, she was reading every time I would do a revision. She'd read it multiple times. I don't know how many times we went back and forth with those opening paragraphs. until I was satisfied that I got it right. And she would stop saying, "You're not quite there yet." But that of course is important. And so, and she's right. I mean, we'll email each other and say, "What do you think about this word? Is this word just a single word?
Right.
Is this word right?" And so this partnership has been invaluable. And it certainly has helped me become the writer that I've become.
And it's interesting, you can do that while you're being respectful of one another's voice. So you're able to critique one another's writing and still retain.
Right. I mean, I might make a suggestion to Cynthia. She may not go with that suggestion, but she will look again at a particular sentence or a particular word and rethink it. And then change it the way it works with her voice, and the same for me.
Well, quickly, this wasn't part of the question, but how did you initially meet through the history department when you were?
So Cynthia finished her MA in spring '03, right? And I arrived in fall '03. Or you actually you finished your writing your thesis, and she learned I'd come. And she read the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas book when it came out in 2009. And
I read it after it was finished, but
Yes.
didn't get to give him any feedback.
no, she did.
This is right. I remember now. I remember how it all started. You had already written the book, so it was too late to help you cut any of the 900 pages.
750. She lived to be 108.
Yeah. But you asked me to comment on the cover, and I'm not on the cover, on the title, and I gave you very honest feedback on the title. Do you remember this?
Oh, right. I was asking everybody because I was fighting for that title. They wanted Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to be the title, and I didn't want that. I wanted, because this is a dual biography of the Everglades, of the place and a person. And so that's what I was trying to convey.
That's how it started. That's how
Okay.
it started.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
I kind of thought it was when you were in graduate school. So,
No, we never met then.
No, she finished just before I got here. Yeah.
so we've got to go to the quick Q&A quickly, but first I want to ask, what other support has been important to you, to both of you?
Writing space, I think, is important. We both have physical space. We both have beautiful studies in our homes, and that's where we like to write. So obviously family support was important, and so
Yeah, I agree with that.
and a nice grant on the sabbatical.
And I would say, we both read at the Lynx opening on Saturday. Was it Saturday? Sunday. And I would say that this community has been really important to both of our writing lives. This community has been a muse for me. And I know that because I have moved and not done as well in other parts of the country as I have living here. And I've kind of, my husband and I have had opportunities to move over the past couple of years. And that was a big thing. It was a big thing that kept me here. And a big thing I thought about was how important this community is to me as an environmental writer. I really think Gainesville is important, both in the natural Gainesville, the prairie and the springs and the trees and all, and the rain and all the things we love in nature, but also the people, and just how many times I have been at the Matheson and felt really supported here, including for the past couple, for book launches and all kinds of things. So yeah,
I think we're also lucky to be where we are at UF. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences has been extremely supportive in my department of what I do. I don't write like a traditional academic, and they, and that doesn't matter. They value what I do, which doesn't mean that you know, scholarship isn't important to me, or that I don't still research my books like a scholar or analyze, the past like a scholar. I just don't write like one. And right. In school, my mentor was, gave me permission to do that. Can I tell a real quick story? I was in Mississippi doing research in the state archives, and statewide ban. How many of you knew statewide ban? Beautiful statewide ban and former colleague of mine. I was a graduate student, and I was in archives researching beautiful writer of Southern history, and Troy Faust, one of beautiful writer of Southern history as well, who went on to become the president of Harvard University. And I'm this graduate student. I went up to them and I invited them to come and have dinner with me that night. And they said yes. And we're driving down the road. I'm in the back seat. And they were asking me, well, what's your dissertation about? And I was telling them, and I said to them, I'm not happy with the conventional dissertation narrative. I want to fiddle with it. And they both at the same time turned around in the front seat of the car and looked at me and said, fiddle with it. And that just gave me the permission to, not necessarily write like, a conventional academic. There's nothing wrong with that. There's an important place for academic writing.
Yeah. Well, both of you are beautiful writers, and I'm speaking for many people, grateful that you don't write in a traditional style, because it's very accessible, and you've really reached out to so many people, both of you. Now we have time for just a few questions, and so if anyone has one.
Yes. That's all. If you have a question, we have a microphone that we're going to be bringing around, and
Yeah,
does that.
All right, I'll say something more.
Pass it back.
Okay. Cynthia, remember when I called you and said I wanted to start writing my memoir? You told me how to arrange my desk to do that writing. That was the most valuable writing advice that I received.
How's it going?
Slow. I finished the civil rights movement. I've done the farm in Alberta. And now I'm talking about politics and Italy.
Wow.
You can talk about a beautiful partnership almost, about how you help each other. You've done this over the years, fighting about this really important, because each other's going to wake up. And I'm wondering how technology, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT comes into play, because it's available 24/7.
I think you ask a good question about AI and ChatGPT. I don't use it at all. And the thing I think about it, a lot of journalists worry a lot about AI and ChatGPT, and isn't this going to take our jobs and all of those things? But what's so important about journalism, and this is something Jack does as a historian that a lot of historians don't do, but it's this ethos of getting your boots muddy, like getting out there and doing reporting, and really doing reporting on the ground. So the only thing AI and ChatGPT know are what has existed before, or all the information that's out there somewhere. And what we do, in addition to the history that we both do, we are both going out and seeing things, observing things, talking to a lot of people, and putting things together in a brand new way, and doing a lot of reporting. So I just think about those tenets of my work a lot, and I haven't turned to ChatGPT or AI at all as a journalist. We talk about it a lot in our classes, and I've used it with student exercises sometimes, just to do fun things like it's good for things like brainstorming headlines. and it'll brainstorm some pretty bad headlines, and then you can sit there together and kind of get better and better with the human input. So I use it somewhat in classes so the students aren't worried about it and see it as the tool that it can be. But I think this work of getting out there and talking with people and doing really deep, immersive reporting is what sets excellent nonfiction apart.
So I've actually taken some sentences and given to Chat GPT, displaying right on and commanded it to write. It's not a very good writer. So there's comments. The definition of comments. It's passive voice. It's grammarly. It's grammarly wrong. So, but Sydney's absolutely right. GPT, AI can write with passion. And Cynthia and I mean, sometimes you go to a place, just even if I'm looking at a place that, I'm writing about it 200 years earlier, I'll still go visit that place because there's something that will stay with me and ultimately find its way through me to my fingertips and to the keyboard that comes out just from that visit. There's a passion that comes through from being interactive with the place. And so Cynthia's absolutely right. It's if you're involved writing, you have to get there, even if you're not taking notes, just to be in a place and to feel it in your bones, if you will.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Flo has one.
Yeah, Sylvia over here. Okay, really quick. So I'm curious. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've loved this panel. So I'm curious, as someone who's an aspiring writer myself and doing all of my research at UF as well, and kind of trying to figure out how in my writing to reconcile the consistent conflicting information that we find in research. A lot has changed in the last 20 years. Let's start 10 years ago, social media, etc. You could find 100 articles that both say the exact same thing or completely different and conflicting information. So kind of reconciling that perfectionism with this kind of writing that's a little less traditional, with conflicting research and the findings. How do you kind of reconcile that information?
That conflict becomes a subject when you write about it. And bring it to the attention of your readers, and then sometimes you just let them decide.
I would add, I think there is a big difference between credible and not credible information. There's so much misinformation, bad information. There is so much manipulation going on, greenwashing.
Right.
But I
Right.
mean, you have to, yeah, it's really important in this field, especially to be able to recognize greenwashing, misinformation, and disinformation. It is all over the place. And sometimes it looks exceedingly credible. Sometimes it will be coming,
Right.
sometimes it will even come from a university, but you'll see that it's not peer reviewed, for example. So I think one key is to make sure the research you're relying on is peer reviewed, and to to really be vigilant about this increasing misinformation that's out there.
Right. U.S. government websites say that the bald was the national bird, but it's not. And Ben Franklin didn't want the turkey. But you're right about it. But yeah, I mean, I think about how information online, just sort of an aside, as part of the story I'm telling in a book, that information has passed from one website to the other, to the point that it saturates the internet, and you think it's the correct information. I've turned that into a little story.
That is the work of life now, to be calling and going
Right.
checking.
And ChatGPT, I'm asking it questions, and
It's wrong.
what's wrong? And I did that because I wanted to be able to tell my set, say, don't depend on ChatGPT. Here's an example in which it gave me the wrong information. But it thanked me when I told Chat that it was wrong.
So, all right. So getting that.
Chat is looking to improve, right? Yeah, I've done that too.
Another reasoning right here for Turcot is George Smatter's library staff and curators could not be more helpful. They thanked in 3 of my books.
Yeah.
Always helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Truck once.
Just the tail light, I think. This question is actually for Jacki. I would like to know what drove you to pick 2 out of these 3 articles written by these wonderful writers. Why did you pick articles that they wrote about other writers rather than writing about beautiful lyric prose about rain and about the Gulf of Mexico and the birds and
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I love it because it's so easy to answer, really. I would have certainly, if we had had a story Cynthia had written about rain that had appeared in Forum, it would have been right there under Roots and Rivers, but we didn't. So when I was going through and picking out the stories, I mean, it was list upon list upon list, calling and wanting to create a narrative that told a story about Florida. And these stories really needed to sort of fit together. With Jack and Cynthia, anything they wrote would have been something I would want to include in the anthology for sure. We have 2 stories by Jack. We have the story that he wrote about the Gulf, which we're very proud at Florida Humanities, very especially proud of that, because apparently Jack was having a little bit of he was going to write this book, but he was having a little trouble launching it. And then he was given this story to write about the Gulf for Forum. And he wrote the story, and then it was just like that. He wrote the rest of the book and then won a Pulitzer Prize. So if it's worthwhile writing for Forum, clearly that's the answer. And Cynthia, the story that Cynthia wrote about Bill Belleville, and I was in tears when I read that, when I read her story. And I gushed over it.
I think
It's one of the best short pieces that I've read that Cynthia's written. Just
I'll
please, yes.
do you think 2 paragraphs is okay? Do we have time? Flo, I think these 2 writers, Bill Belleville and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, had to be in the anthology, and this was a great way to do it. But I think we can end with a little bit so that we can hear Bill Belleville himself. The river preacher was never preachy. Indeed, the most interesting thing about Belleville as a writer was his ultimate rejection of the forms the rest of us rely on most. After years of reporting on the environment for Discovery Channel, Newsweek, and countless others, he felt that journalism was too often corrupted by false objectivity. Science writing, he said, was too abstract. Advocacy was too polemic. He gently admonished eco-ninnies. Environmental political correctness he feared would drive people apart rather than drawing them together around shared awe for wild waters, lands, and animals. For as many dear friends as he counted among scientists, he also did not put all his stock in science-based conservation, the mantra oft repeated by elected officials who are in fact far more moved by their supporters' passions than by data points. The work of the writer and the environmental humanities at large is to help people feel, to touch their hearts.
You see why it had to be in was perfect. Perfect. It was perfect. I mean, certainly, not only does Cynthia convey Bill Belleville, but she conveys the message of Bill Belleville, which is similar to her own in this love of the environment and care for the environment. So
They'll have to buy the book, which is for sale in the back.
So in conclusion, because Stephanie is going to pull the cords, and maybe that's what happened. If you have a copy of the book, thank you so much for supporting Florida Humanities. And the panelists and I will be available for book signing if you want to. We're here. We'll be happy to sign your book. If you don't have a copy yet, it's not too soon for Christmas. Book sales are still open in the back of the room. So you can buy a copy or 2 or 3 and receive a special Florida Humanities tote bag. Don't forget, Florida Humanities members get a special discount. And I love Florida Humanities. I didn't talk about it much tonight, but it is well worth becoming a member of Florida.
Yes, and Matheson, don't forget the Matheson. They're 2 great organizations, partnering here.
Also, you have on your chair these clear bags, most of which have magazines in them. But there are, if you don't, or even if you'd like another one, there's a whole extra box of magazines in the back, and we'd love for you to take one. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Cynthia, and I want to thank Jack, and thank you all so much for coming. And sorry for the technical difficulties, but we got through them. So thanks so much, and see you again soon. Thank you, Jack.